Hello and welcome to this World Extreme Medicine podcast in which we will be focusing on safeguarding in humanitarian work. My name is Deb Swann. I'm an advanced clinical practitioner in emergency medicine, a pre-hospital emergency medicine nurse, expedition medic, medic for UK International Search and Rescue Team and member of the WEM faculty. Today I'm joined by Zoe Clift, a physiotherapist who works for Humanitarian and Inclusion, a charity which works alongside vulnerable and disabled people in areas of poverty, disaster and conflict. She is also the UK Emergency Medical Team Rehab project manager and is speaking to us today independently about her knowledge and experience of safeguarding in the humanitarian arena. Zoe, welcome and thank you very much for taking time to speak to us today.
Thanks, Deb. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Fantastic. So, firstly, I wanted to speak to you or get you to tell us about your career pathway, where it started and how you progressed from NHS physiotherapist to a global emergency physiotherapist.
Sure. It's a sort of fortuitous pathway. I think probably other people have explained it that way, and you'd always like to say it was completely planned and each step was planned out with a 5-year plan, etc. No, much of it you'll probably hear is by accident or default and just following opportunities. So I qualified as a physio back in horribly 1998 now, which feels like yesterday and about 100 years ago all at the same time.
It was only yesterday, I'm sure.
Thank you for that. Nice little
You're welcome.
confidence boost. And yeah, I started, as every physio does, doing rotations to get a broad range of experience, and I actually left the UK and went travelling in New Zealand and Australia back in sort of around about 99, 2000, and was really fortunate to have an opportunity to work in Western Australia. At the time, being able to transfer your skills from UK to Australia was very different, and you basically, if you had a qualification in the UK, it was transferable. And I got the opportunity to work in the Kimberley region, so the northwest of Australia, which really, it had a hub hospital, but it was really rural and remote, working with Indigenous populations, so Aboriginal communities. And that was probably my first entry into different forms of physiotherapy and working internationally. I would say, looking back at that now, how much of an impact that would have on my career going forwards. And really working in Aboriginal community and really quite remote areas of Australia set me up quite well for different aspects of my work going forward. But then I came back to the UK and really specialised in burns and plastics physiotherapy, so orthoplastics and ultimately limb reconstruction. So that was in the NHS, and then over the next sort of 20 years was really fortunate to work in most of the big regional units in England, some in London, the East Grinstead Queen Victoria Burns unit, which was really a massive learning experience for me, and really developed sort of burns and orthoplastic experience, which was really useful for then overseas work. And I was really fortunate to work with, at the time, different surgeons who were very pro working abroad and developing burns and plastics skills in low to middle income countries. And really, that was back in sort of 2004, and pretty lucky to work with surgeons who had a foresight and wanted to think beyond surgery. So they'd been away and worked in burns units and said, actually, what we need to do is think about rehabilitation as well. And again, that was my sort of second entry into international work. And I was lucky to work with an organisation called Resurge Africa, who focus on plastics and reconstructive surgery, predominantly in West Africa. And I worked with the team at Korlebu Burns Unit in Ghana, in Accra. So I did a bit of that. Then carried on working with different surgeons and different organisations over periods of time. And that was with a combination of British Society of Surgery of the Hand and BFIRST, the reconstructive surgery training programme in places like Bangladesh and Malawi. So it was always a combination of NHS work, taking a bit of leave, so annual leave from the NHS, and then going and doing very short burst projects. So, 1 to 2 weeks here and there, and then coming back, carrying on my normal job, and vice versa. So that was really the start for me, basically being lucky to be with people that gave me an opportunity to do different things and work with people in different countries that were familiar with that environment, and national staff who, you can share your skills with, but you learn a huge amount from in the process. So that's sort of my NHS start, and then my career transitioned really into much more humanitarian focus, and that was via links with the UK emergency medical team, originally on their roster of NHS staff, and then taking my job role at Humanity and Inclusion.
For people in the UK working in the NHS, that there is access to some pretty amazing colleagues who are already involved in that work, and it's just getting to know people, isn't it, and talking to people and being interested in what they do, and then if you have a commonality, you can then use it to your advantage, and then to the advantage of the people that you're helping. And I think we've all been there with taking leave and doing things in our own time to learn from those experiences and to give our skills to other people who are also in need. So you've had a lot of experience in the humanitarian field, and after listening to a talk given by you for a UK ISAR training event, I realised that actually what I thought I knew about safeguarding probably wasn't as much as I thought. And in the NHS, we have to do mandatory safeguarding training, and I didn't realise that safeguarding has different interpretations and nuances depending on the organisation you're working for, and my particular interest is safeguarding within the humanitarian field. And I think for me in particular, and probably for a lot of people, that you automatically think about the Oxfam scandal, but it's there's a lot more to it than that. So I just wanted to talk about, for listeners who want to work in the humanitarian sector, are perhaps about to undertake their first mission, or for people who are already working in that sector and perhaps are working for a smaller organisation. Can you give us an introduction to safeguarding, and from a humanitarian perspective, what does it mean?
Yeah, it's I'm going to caveat this bit, because there are people that work in the humanitarian sector who are experts in this field. I am definitely not an expert in this field. My background is rehabilitation, but I think by the nature of working in rehabilitation, you tend to spend significant portions of time with the people that you're interacting with, and by default you end up having some more responsibility and a bit more understanding of some of the things that we'll probably talk about this evening. So yeah, I'm definitely not a safeguarding and protection expert for the people that do that all day, every day as their speciality role. But I think sometimes some of the information you can get from some of the experts, if you're somebody like I was that has a full-time NHS job, or you have another role and you're doing short missions, or you're working with smaller organisations, sometimes the high-level information about safeguarding and protection isn't as accessible for introductory understanding. So I think one of the things that I'd realised as my role changed to work with humanity and inclusion was my understanding of the terms safeguarding in the NHS was not the same as my colleagues working in the humanitarian sector. And that's been fairly consistent, and it's one of the things that I end up doing lots of introductory talks about, is what do we mean by safeguarding in our normal day-to-day lives, potentially in the NHS, and what does that mean in the humanitarian sector? And they are slightly different. So this is butchering it slightly, but for an easy intro, the way to think about it tends to be in the humanitarian sector. If you think of safeguarding as looking sort of internally facing at your own organisation and your own staff, how they interact with each other, how they interact with people that you're going to be working with, be it patients, beneficiaries, etc. And then think of protection as something different. There are crossovers, but something different in terms of external facing. Who are the people? How are they impacted in their normal day-to-day lives? What are their vulnerabilities, pre-existing or changing, and how does that relate to them coming into the world that you're working in? So I think that's probably the easiest way of talking about that challenge, because I certainly know that working in the NHS, safeguarding is sort of a ballpark term for all of those elements that we're talking about, and that's often where confusion can lie. It's
I think referring to the NHS version of safeguarding, if you will, is about protecting citizens' health, well-being and human rights, which that's a lot of things. But I think a lot of people think it's about child protection, it's about perhaps vulnerable adults. But I think, like you said, in terms of the humanitarian sector, thinking of it in terms of internal, your organisation, and then the external effects of what's going on outside of that organisation helps to break it up a little. And I think with humanitarian projects, there's a power dynamic, isn't there? There's and that can be a problem. It unfortunately it can attract people that want to take advantage of that situation, particularly if an organisation is recruiting rapidly for a disaster or a crisis or emergency. That can make that organisation fragile to being used and manipulated, can't it? I think so. I think one of the great things that has happened over a period of time is that organisations are very much more robust on that element now, and it's about having those systems and processes in place and being consistent about it, and having a very very baseline level, so that at times of surge in recruitment, that process is normal and it happens the same, and the checks and balances are there. And again, I'm not involved in the actual recruitment side. I'm very much more on the protection side. But I think that is definitely one of the things that a lot of organisations have improved on,
are continuing to do so and continually reviewing their processes, and also making sure those processes are fair and equitable, whether it's, national staff, international staff, volunteers, anybody that's interacting with that organisation, and then how they are going to interact with the people that they're working to support and care for and help.
And I suppose for those people who are new to humanitarian work, what should they be looking for in the organisation that they are choosing to work for in terms of safeguarding processes? What looks like a good safeguarding and protection strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think from a safeguarding and protection side of things, again, if you split it out, you've got to look at how those organisations are looking after their own staff, how the recruitment process happens, how clear the information is about what their culture is as an organisation, what their objectives are and what their strategies are, and how they look to go about achieving those. And that includes how they look after their own staff, what support there is, what processes there are to helping you be in your best position to fulfil those objectives and be comfortable doing so. So it's about information sharing, as well as the usual checks and balances of codes of conduct and screening, all of those sorts of things. And that goes from everything from looking at, work patterns, healthcare and health checks and vaccinations, all the way through on a spectrum to things about debriefing and mental health and well-being and support, both pre-deployment, during your mission or your trip, and then what are the processes in place for after. Looking at things like their complaint systems and their whistleblowing strategies, all of those things should be pretty visible. And I think sometimes that's easier to do if you're taking on a permanent job with a humanitarian organisation, or you're going to do a longer term project, be it 6 months, 12 months, beyond that, compared to people that might be doing really short things, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that sort of thing. And it should be and can be just as important.
That's really interesting, actually, thinking about the HR perspective of an organisation and how they treat their staff, and work patterns, and debriefing and support for staff. Because I think if you have staff that aren't looking after each other, then you've potentially got staff who aren't really going to be looking after the people that they're going to help, if that makes sense. And in terms of sort kind of rapid recruitments and short deployments, I suppose if an organisation has a high turnover of staff or inexperienced staff working for them, that opens up the risk of safeguarding issues there as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's getting balance, isn't it? I think it's like any team that you're building. I suppose your ideal mix is not everybody who's been in the organisation years and years and years. You want a mix of new to the organisation, sort of mid-term, longer term people. So you get that balance right, and everybody can bring different skills. But yeah, high turnover, very short term, high turnover, it would make you look at things slightly differently, and there may well be very good reasons that aren't around safeguarding for that. I think there are some there are some elements that you'd want to consider in terms of things like burnout, and they are often stressful environments, and it puts people under pressure, and people work and react in different ways. So I think there is that element of safeguarding, as you say, about looking after your own staff and people, putting them in the best position to be able to support each other, make good decisions. You're not going to get everything right all of the time, but you want some of those strategies in place so that if there are issues at a lower level, they can be highlighted and, going through that lessons learned process. But I think, again, I've had a lot of people mention that things have improved, but there is definitely still that element of, how do you support somebody who goes through stressful environments, be it the situation they're working in, the people they work with. That's one of the things, again, is improving, but still more work to be done.
And in terms of going overseas to do humanitarian work, in terms of the protection side of things, so looking kind of external to the organisation that you've deployed with, what sort of considerations should people have? I know it's country dependent, culture dependent, the context in which you are, you're deployed. But are there any general things to be mindful of?
Yeah. This is the area that I would really want to focus on.
Okay, let's do it.
Because I think there's huge potential. I think all of those things that you mentioned would tick loads of boxes. So yes, being aware that different settings, different circumstances, different populations all come with different protection concerns, things that you would want to be focused on, things that you would want to be looking out for. So I think maybe the first thing to think about is knowing the environment that you're going to. And that can be really quick, sort of just-in-time training, thinking about how do you get as much information about the cultural context, the religious context, the normalities of day-to-day life in wherever you're going to. Some of that you can research before you go in various different ways. Some of that is, certainly from my experiences, having really good relationships with the people that live that life day in, day out, the people that you're working with, national staff, in-country teams, etc., etc. And being in that environment, I think one of the biggest things that me and a colleague, particularly with the work that we do now, are really keen to push to the forefront is a lot of people will commonly think about children and vulnerable children, which is absolutely right, but anybody on that age spectrum can be vulnerable. There are particular things about child protection that you clearly want to focus on, but that can go for, it's the same in the UK, that a person can be a vulnerable adult, and at the other end of sort of lifespan, there's things like gender-based violence, that side of things, and again, that's traditionally and most commonly thought of as women, but it's not always women. It's trying to keep away from those traditional, generalised, generic box type thinking. And the other thing, particularly for my work in rehabilitation, is disability. And one of the things that I tend to regularly keep in my mind is when you're working, thinking about the people that you're not seeing. So all of those people, so my work is medical, and you can be extremely busy from a medical point of view. but are you seeing one particular pattern of society? And, you know, there are different ratios you can work on, but in a population of people you're seeing, particularly in emergency, 30% of those people you're expecting to have a pre-existing disability, and if you're not seeing them, where are they? So it's things like that to keep in mind. So it's a lot of being as familiar as you can with the cultural context. It's being very aware of who you're seeing or who you're hearing, and who you're not, and watching for patterns of who's presenting to your care and who's not, and why that might be. And those are probably some of the quicker, easier tips to think about.
That's really interesting, and that's certainly really useful thing to think about, because people with disabilities in some countries are already vulnerable and disadvantaged because they're stigmatized, and you know they are marginalized. So in an emergency crisis situation, that is only going to get worse for them, and that's really interesting. So kind of going back to what you've already said about knowing the country that you're going to, being, you know, as familiar as you can about the culture and the norms of that country. And it's really poignant, actually, you know, the statistic of, you know, in a population, 30% of people will have some form of disability. And if you're not seeing them, absolutely, where are they? That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think, you know, particularly looking at emergency medical stuff, that 30% statistic, it's probably changed, but it's a good sort of ballpark to keep in the back of your mind. So, and also bearing in mind that disability isn't necessarily the thing that jumps out that you can see. We've recently been doing some work on communication impairment, and you know that will be as broad as if you can't hear a cyclone siren, tsunami siren go off, how do you know? Or if you're in the middle of an emergency setting and all of the information about where to go and seek treatment is written and you can't read, how do you access that care? And that could be you can't read normally, or your language isn't a written language, it's just verbal. It could be things like things aren't translated into your dialect, etc., etc., or you know, even pictorial things might be very Western images, and they don't translate to your environment in, you know, wherever you might be, a Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, for example. It's those sorts of things, and then thinking, you know, if you try and translate that to sort of COVID times and working in different countries, what is your COVID testing site? What does it look like? Where is it? Is it, you know, I had a really good experience with a team when I was away working in Beirut following the explosion and then during COVID, where they didn't have a rehabilitation professional on their team. They didn't have anybody with a sort of protection background, but we had a bit of a chat, and they came back to a meeting 2 days later and said, oh, actually what we've done is changed the PCR testing site because we realised it was up 2 flights of stairs, and it was in a basically one of those shipping containers that had been adapted. So they moved it, and it had a slope up to it, and they were like, well, you know, now people in wheelchairs or have challenges walking can access PCR testing. It's just simple things like that, and that was a great result, actually.
That's a fantastic result, and like you said, it is so simple that sometimes the really simple things and the simple solutions aren't at the forefront of your mind. You're kind of thinking, about more complicated things, but actually simple and the basics always work well, don't they, before you can progress to doing more fancy stuff. That's amazing, and it certainly gets you thinking differently about, I suppose, going from a nice, comfortable, wealthy country where life isn't too bad, and then being transported to a developing country, the low economic growth, and the culture is different. And how do you respond to that? You're taking your own culture, you're going with your own morals, dictated by your country, your culture, and you're going to something that is completely different that you're not used to. How would you advise people to deal with that, or is it just a you find out when you get there situation?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think it's different if you've got planned trips and you're repeatedly going back to a similar part of the world, or a similar place. So I certainly had the great fortune to go back to the Korle Burns unit in Ghana over a 5-year period, and some of my thoughts and assumptions, if I compare them from year 1 to year 5, definitely changed, and that's both, I had research before I'd gone, but that's just learning from people who live in that setting, in that society, and getting to understand it a bit more. So I think if you're on a longer term program, you just live that sort of learning cycle. I think it's more difficult if you're hopping from one to another really short term and quite quickly. I think if you're going to work consistently in humanitarian settings, there are certainly areas of the world that you can focus some of your research on. So for me, I know that there's a high likelihood that I'm going to be going to different parts of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So I'll gradually over time just keep reading, listening to podcasts, sucking up all the free information that there is online. And there's a huge amount available online, if you know where to find it.
That's the key.
Yeah, that if you know where to find it is definitely the key. And I think be careful about making assumptions, but also don't tie yourself in knots. It's going to be hopefully a shared learning experience, and there are certain elements from your own culture that can mould with the culture that you're going to change things. So yeah, there are definitely tricky things. Some of the things that I've certainly encountered are, the lives of women around the world are hugely varied. So, how do you make sure that certainly healthcare is made the most available for women that can't leave the house without a male guardian? And it's thinking about how you might adapt your practice in those different settings and societies, rather than just saying, well, they just have to be allowed to leave, because that is their culture, and understanding that for actually a lot of women it would be extremely strange and uncomfortable to move away from that tradition and that culture, and it's something that they value hugely. It's not always massively negative for them.
And we do these things because we want to help and we have good intentions, but sometimes our good intentions can potentially cause more harm, can't they, if we're perhaps naive about a situation that we're going into and we're perhaps not prepared to adjust our beliefs and our I suppose and not willing to learn about the place that you're in, which would be difficult on a short-term mission or deployment, wouldn't it? So because we don't know how we are going to react to a completely different country and culture, and potentially we don't know how the people from that country are going to react towards us. I suppose it's about having respect for where you're going, and who you're dealing with, perhaps. Yeah,
I think it's sort of respecting your own values. There's a lot about understanding and knowing yourself and how you will react to some of those things. And again, a lot of the time you're only really going to test that out and find that out when you're in those scenarios. Likewise, it's respecting and acknowledging the culture and the area of the world that you're going to, and also knowing what your red lines are, and how you might deal with, or your organisation might deal with some of those red lines, and how that process works. So, for example, if you came across somebody who, I suppose a child would be a more familiar one for people to think about, but if you came across a child that you were concerned about and that family it was challenging for you coming from a different culture to address that, what is your next port of call? Or particularly if you're not hugely experienced, what do you then do? And understanding what your organisation's processes are around protection, or what the whole coordination system is around protection, and how that can work to both help you in a difficult situation and that child and that family.
That comes back to safeguarding, looking at the internal structure of your organisation, isn't it? And also the protection side of that as well. That's both elements there, isn't it? And it probably tests a lot of people, in that moment of what to do and how do you deal with it. And I think perhaps knowing your organisation's structure of how they deal with that, reporting systems, are they robust reporting systems, or are they weak reporting systems, has an impact, doesn't it, on how you deal with that. And also debriefing from a situation, if you have been, if you've seen something particularly challenging or been involved with something particularly horrific in your eyes, how do you deal with that in the aftermath and post mission as well?
Yeah, I'd say yes to all of those. So I think, again, it's thinking about what can you know what can you find out before you go? So what are your organisation systems and processes? Who is the lead or the focal point for safeguarding and or protection? Sometimes those roles cross over, sometimes they're very separate. What is the system and process if you're going to a heightened emergency on a background of, say, a complex humanitarian setting? There will be coordination processes already in place, particularly if there are known vulnerabilities. If you throw in a disaster of, say, earthquake, for example, if you've got underlying vulnerabilities, as all populations will do, you can be the most organised, well-funded, well-structured country in the world, but it will put your systems and the people within it under huge amounts of pressure and stress, and vulnerability will rise. So again, knowing what those coordination structures are and how you interact with them are pretty key.
And going back to, a humanitarian is someone who wants to help and do no harm. Can we do harm sometimes? Unwittingly do harm? Yes.
I think everybody would want to say no, but I think, I would say that everybody's coming from a good place. All of those interactions are going to be coming from a good place. But I think you're particularly challenged if you're new to international work, or you're new to a particular environment. If you're used to working in, one part of the world and you go to an extremely different cultural setting, if you're not used to working with potentially the combination of emergency environment plus internally displaced people, plus or minus an element of conflict, you just add on another layer each time. And you're somebody that, again, if we take the example of people who have a normal day job, be it in the NHS or whatever in the UK, and are doing short, small missions, and they're not familiar with the wider setup in that country. So organisations, be it NGOs, who are there working for long periods of time, you can fall into different traps, and it's really difficult. It could be something like, handing out sweets or oranges or whatever to people who, are clearly wanting food. Does that fit within that structure of sustainable humanitarian involvement? Probably not. If you've got an established food programme going.
Yeah. So it's also knowing what other organisations are doing in that area as well, isn't it? Because you have different objectives potentially on what you're doing. Are there any online toolkits that you would recommend, or that you know of, that would be useful for people to look at in terms of safeguarding and protection as a starting point?
Yeah, I think there's huge amounts that's out there free. So a lot of online learning. If you look at certain platforms like Kaya and Disaster Ready, they have huge amounts of really relevant protection and safeguarding training. If you wanted to go a bit more into detail, you could look at the Global Humanitarian Cluster System, particularly on protection. But there's equal value to things like there are podcasts out there that, one that I've particularly listened to, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. They've got some really good resource on their podcast that focus around particularly on safeguarding and protection. And, you'll see them, they're back from 2018, 2019, but they're a really good introduction into a slightly different world of humanitarian-based protection. Same can be said for anything on the New Humanitarians podcast. Mm-hmm. And their website, to be honest, for learning and reading. I mean, they cover huge, broad scope on humanitarian involvement, from finance and funding to challenging areas, but within that they cover a lot of safeguarding protection side of things.
Fantastic. So we've had a bit of an introduction to safeguarding and protection in the humanitarian setting. And I've certainly learnt even more from you, Zoe, than you've already taught me last year. And it's absolutely fascinating, and it certainly has given me other things to consider when working overseas. And it's just been really fascinating to talk to you today. Do you have any top tips for people in terms of safeguarding and protection? Any top tips for people that are just getting into the working overseas or are considering it?
Yeah, I think no matter what sort of technical speciality you come from, what background you come from, different aspects of health, search and rescue, logistics, operations. I don't think this is something that's isolated to one portion of people that are working overseas. It's everybody's duty and responsibility to have a certain amount of awareness. So that would be the first thing. Don't leave it to somebody else. The main thing I would say is understand the organisation that you're going to be working with and working for, whether it's a week, whether it's 5 years, whatever the programme is that you're going to be working with and delivering, and getting as much information as you can on their safeguarding strategies for both you as a member of staff or volunteer, your colleagues, and then the people that you're going to be delivering your programme to. It sets you in a really good stand for then if you do come across any tricky circumstances while you're away or when you're back. And then more from the protection side of things, which I'm hugely passionate about, is understanding the cultural environment that you're going to be working within, not making or trying not to make predetermined decisions, and being open to listening and learning about what that environment's like, but also really refreshing in your mind who you are seeing, who you're working with, and who's missing. And that's probably one of the biggest things, is whether it's a short mission, whether it's a longer term deployment, you're going to be very busy and you're often going to be really tired, and you can get into a bit of a pattern of just doing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and just taking a few moments to think about, okay, who is it we're interacting with? Are we missing a portion of society? And then thinking pretty broadly, but not trying to make things too complicated about, if there are people missing, how do you make things more accessible to them? How do you create a space where somebody who is vulnerable can talk to you about something? Or how do you even get them to be able to interact with whatever it is you're delivering? So I think those are they sound like big topics, but I think something you said earlier, Deb, was not trying to make it too complicated, particularly if this is something that's not your technical background. It's, understand your processes, keep it super simple, keep an open mind, and just keep learning and adapting. Fantastic,
and a great take-home message from this podcast today. Before we wrap up, Zoe Clift, I'd like to know 3 things from you. Firstly, what was the last book you read?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh God!
It's okay if it was the Train Spotter's Almanac. We won't judge you. This is a safe space. You can tell us anything.
Well, it was not the Train Spotter's Almanac. It is, however, very topical. Actually, it's A Little Life, and yeah, there are huge amounts of protection elements in that book. I would recommend the read. It's one of the most amazing books I've ever read, but you need to be pretty stoic.
Okay, good to know. And that's called A Little Life.
A Little Life, yeah.
Fantastic. And name one of your favourite travel destinations.
I can give you a holiday one and
go for it. Go on.
working one. So Costa Rica. I love Costa Rica as a travel holiday destination. It's just the most beautiful place and amazing animal life, flora, fauna, the rest of it, and a really good ethos on sustainability, actually.
Okay.
And from a working environment, I love working in the Middle East.
Okay.
I find the culture, the people, fascinating, hugely varied, and I learn masses every time I go, both about myself, about the different countries, and I think it's a fascinating part of the world.
Yeah, I think the Middle East is fascinating as well, actually. So I'm with you on that. And finally, name one of your top 10 movies.
Oh, my work colleagues would absolutely laugh at this because I'm notorious for my absolute lack of film knowledge or watching. So I'm wishing they were here now to be able to tell me.
To tell you what your favourite movie is.
Yeah, exactly. I can hear them now laughing at me. Favourite movie?
Or in like a top 10, doesn't have to be the favourite, because my favourite movies change as the wind changes, so...
Well, I'm going to go... One of my favourites to watch on a plane is Goodfellas.
Is it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't fit the context of this podcast at all.
No, it doesn't, not at all.
But yeah, for on a plane travel, that Goodfellas is quite a good movie. To watch.
Yeah, it's a good movie. It's a movie I've seen more than once, so it must be good. Yeah.
There you
Fantastic. Well, Zoe, thank you so much for an informative talk on the WEM podcast today. It's been really interesting, and we can add any links to any recommendations in the notes to the podcast. Zoe, thank you very much.
Thank you.